Since this is a workshop, I want to explore a few things that I've been recently working on that have grown out of my long-standing interest in Minoan society, spatial behavior, urbanism, and some recent challenges that are emerging from the current field work that I'm doing at Knossos. Specifically, I will aim to review various recent approaches to Minoan urbanism. I want to look more widely at Bronze Age urban structure, particularly institutions, centralization, and integration. I want to look at early urban centers as fundamentally agriculturally based towns, examine briefly the comparative development of the major Minoan centers, consider Knossos as a consumer city, which faced exceptional logistical problems, consider the composition of the Knossian population, and that's where we get into individuals and differentiation within an urban site, and finally end by raising a few wider implications for Cretan society and change, the dynamics that Kenton was talking about. Now, Crete's situated pretty much at the western extent of palace-centered Bronze Age states of the ancient Near East. This has usually been considered in terms of the origins of complex societies on Crete, but the reaction over the past 4 decades against a very uncritical diffusionary perspective has led us to largely ignore other ways of thinking about this relationship or what we can learn from it. And today I want to ask what we might learn from the diverse and in many cases better documented urban societies across this region about the characteristics of Bronze Age urbanism. Essentially, can we learn anything from comparisons analogically about how Bronze Age palace-centered urban systems actually worked? To date, we've largely gone it alone, working up very descriptively from our Cretan data without really considering potentially appropriate models. As across much of this wider region, we have considerable relevant resources to draw upon, as Kenton mentioned, particularly in terms of extensive early excavations at a number of sites. These have all the advantages and the disadvantages of early archaeological data. They provide very extensive exposures, which we simply cannot afford to excavate today. But these also provide only limited information. Though as new field work becomes increasingly expensive, we are increasingly returning to the archival records and finding out that rather more can be extracted from them. The last couple of decades have seen significant work at most of these early excavated sites on Crete, where new targeted field work can allow us to contextualize those older excavations, as at Psira with comprehensive cleaning, documentation, and strategic excavation, or Palekastro, where a combination of surface survey and new excavations are helping to put the original investigated area into its community-wide context, as we've just seen. And of course, these reinvestigations have been complemented by very well-controlled and thoroughly published excavations at a smaller number of newly investigated sites, such as Komos. Now, these sites can be considered urban in character, but for an investigation of Minoan urbanism and urbanization, I think we really have to turn to the major palatial centers. It is at these larger centers that we can expect to document the full range of urban phenomena and recognize scale-dependent emergent phenomena, which provide the key to how such urban systems worked. I'm doubtful that it is simply a matter of scaling up the same characteristics at sites of all scales and complexity. And for these communities, the palaces themselves have obviously dominated our research. But I think we are beginning to be in a position to start to sketch in the character and development of these communities as a whole, though as the black dots here, representing the individual trenches or tests, as they indicate, these are still very variable and very patchy pictures. But I think we need to start considering what we wish to learn and how to use the available evidence to structure future research. At the core of Minoan sites are palaces or other major structures with evidence for administration, storage, and ceremonial performances. These are surrounded by public spaces, courts for other ceremonies, occasionally some other public or administrative buildings, and beyond these, residential houses. But the palaces have very much dominated our studies. They were clearly important for the Minoans as well, conceptually and often physically, at the core of their communities, and with other spaces seemingly defined with reference to them. But there are other significant components of Minoan urban centers as well. 15 years ago, I started to explore a community-wide view to look beyond the palaces to the bulk of the population, at Minoan sites as communities of people. I tried to document one characteristic of urbanism using the scale of differences in house size to suggest these sites house differentiated populations. Within the residential areas, there's considerable variation in house size and investment in construction and elaboration, documenting a significantly differentiated population. While limited by the excavated areas, this pointed up some intra-site, but also inter-site distinctions, for example, between the major palatial centres and smaller communities such as Gornia and Psira. Some of the potential for reassessing early data is illustrated by Vance Watrous and Amy Heimroth's recent study of evidence for craft production at Gornia. And John McEnroe's architectural study of Psira has provided a framework for studying the development of the community, from a scatter of houses infilling to a dense community over several generations within LM1. For Knossos, I suggested a broadly concentric structure with higher density, grander houses concentrated at the core, near the palace, and lower density housing as one moved towards the edges of the city. One may see elements of this with larger houses concentrated near palaces at other sites, though here we are somewhat constrained by the fact that most excavations have been in these core areas. Recent work is beginning to consider this kind of patterning in more detail, suggesting larger, grander, or wealthier houses dominating local neighbourhoods, as in John Zielinski's as well as Watrous and Heimroth's work at Gornia, and Jan Driessen and Tim Cunningham have suggested similar social neighbourhoods for blocks at Palais Castro. I've wondered whether a similar pattern may be seen at Zakros, where the large cyclopean houses seem to anchor the layout, with smaller houses infilling, possibly the houses of clients associated with the residents of the grand houses. For examining urban organisation, our most comprehensive picture is from proto-palatial Malia, where there have been very extensive excavations at the core of the site. Paralleling the other major centres, we have a palace forming the focus at the most ancient core of the site. Nearby, the agora, the hypostyle crypt, and the portico form an interlinked complex not yet documented at the other palatial sites, also in direct association with the palace and opening off the palace's west court. A structure with some elements similar to the crypt excavated at Festos may indicate that these are more general features at major centres, at least in the proto-palatial period. The two small Middle Minoan shrines are only paralleled by similar small shrines at a few late Minoan sites. Their small scale and lack of associated courts or major access indicates these were not major foci of public ceremony. And finally, the major complex of Quartier Mu and possibly similar establishments represented by the Magasin de Saint and possibly a predecessor of the late Bronze Age Quartier Epsilon provides some of the most intriguing elements of this urban structure. Quartier Mu, excavated carefully and being published thoroughly, has begun to be the focus of large architectural explorations, as Kent illustrated earlier, which I hope will expand to artifact distributional analyses as the non-ceramic finds are now being published. It certainly holds out considerable promise for understanding a major element in Middle Minoan urbanism. Its large, spatially differentiated central structures, with evidence for administration, storage, cult, and ceremony, provide precisely the sort of evidence that we would have anticipated for, but was not preserved or documented well for the palace itself. The associated specialized workshops evoke a model of attached client craft production, which is then moving us out away from the central structure itself. So far, there have been limited synthetic attempts to pull these elements together and consider the character of urbanization at Malia. In the most recent and detailed, the multiplicity of major structures has been the basis for Ilse Scoop's proposal of a heterarchical rather than hierarchical structure for proto-palatial states, with the major monuments representing factions as the principal components of the community. While I'm in considerable agreement with individual elements of her discussion, I have major overall problems with the big picture, because the heterarchical model itself is simply so vague. It was originally proposed to account for alternative integrating principles within hierarchically organized societies, not as an alternative to hierarchy. This vagueness plagues all discussions of heterarchy elsewhere in archaeology as well, which basically means that whatever you want it to be, as long as it isn't hierarchy. I'm certainly willing to consider the Magasin de Saint as another potential mu-type complex, and the recent restudy of Quartier Epsilon will hopefully provide more information on its possible predecessors. I'd like to leave Katia Alpha out of that equation because it's just so poorly preserved that we really don't know what it represents, whether multiple houses or a larger integrated complex. Heterarchy has not had much support elsewhere within archaeology, being too vague a set of ideas to map onto known state systems or generate diagnostic material expectations. The one area where I have seen some more positive engagement is for lowland Maya communities, where the separation of multiple major mound groups suggests some sort of distributed, though not necessarily non-hierarchical, power structure. But intriguingly, this is not a picture given much support by the rich elite epigraphic material available for the mine sites. But the underlying distributional distinctions are much less obvious in densely packed Malia. But a multiplicity of major architectural complexes, which essentially is the prompt for the heterarchy model, is by no means surprising within hierarchically organized centers, states, and urban centers. And here I've just highlighted the multiple contemporary palaces at two early second millennium Near Eastern centers, Ebla and Mari. In these cases, the texts allow us to identify palaces of the ruler and some potentially used by his close kin. Similarly, at Amarna, the pharaoh had several palaces, and one may have been used by the royal vizier. Indeed, one only has to think of medieval European contexts to see that multiple foci of power, in the medieval context, state and the church, and factional behavior among noble families are integral to hierarchical power structures. Now, having brought in the ancient Near Eastern comparanda, can these help us any further in thinking about Minoan urbanism? Ur is regularly invoked and illustrated as the archetypal ancient Near Eastern city. In fact, what is illustrated, which I put on the left, is only the fortified core of a much larger city, which I put on the right. Overall, this seems to make intuitive sense that the core structuring institutions of a city should be located centrally, readily accessible to all, and providing a social focus for the community, which is essentially the classic concentric urban model. Extensive work over the past 2 decades, particularly in Upper Mesopotamia, is providing a whole new level of detail about early urban sites. At Tel Chuera, extensive geophysics, along with major excavations in the core, upper city, have provided the most comprehensive overview of a 3rd millennium city. Combining the two sources of information on the right shows the palace and major temple at different ends of an axis through the city. Helped by the radial structure of the street, one's immediately reminded of sectorial models of urban structure. But, turning to the nearby center at Tel Beidar, the same elements are clustered at the core of the site. So perhaps we need to think more in terms of local historical contingencies determining the specific spatial configuration of a set of common major structural elements. Turning to 2nd millennium Ugarit, we get a different picture, with a pretty clear separation of major temples on the high ground in the northeast and the palace and most of the other major residences, some of individuals we know to have been prominent in the administration of the state, at the northeast. One is tempted here to think of polycentric or polyfocal urban models. In fact, in most Near Eastern cities, there was usually a distinct separation between the major palace and the major temple, defining clear poles of secular and religious power. Texts are less clear on the relations between these two, since many of the texts are largely internal institutional accounts, not political histories. The relative importance of each of these institutions varied in both time and space, probably due to individual and local dynamics. And overall, there was some kind of convergence in interest through time, as rulers were able to assert increasing influence over religious institutions. While these and other geographical models are regularly dusted off, as most recently by Marcus and Sabloff, they've been developed. What's usually forgotten or not really addressed is that they've been developed to explain the spatial organization of large industrial or increasingly post-industrial cities. The discussions usefully note that these can remind us of ways that we might think about the situations that we're trying to understand, but they usually give little consideration to the actual relevance of these models to pre-industrial contexts. The command economies of the Bronze Age palace-centered societies that we're dealing with are fundamentally different from the commercial and industrial contexts of recent urban centers. I'm afraid we really will have to develop relevant models of our own, and looking comparatively at the Bronze Age palace centres contexts more widely within the ancient world appears to me to be the best place to start. Another problem I have with them is the vast differences of scale, which surely must be relevant. One could walk across the largest of these ancient urban cities in about 15 minutes, negating most of the economic land value arguments that underpin these modern models. While we, like urban geographers, have a tendency to develop classifications based on form, the sheer diversity of ancient Near Eastern urban layouts, while it may represent diverse underlying structures, I think is maybe encouraging us to think that the actual physical layout is rather less important than the nature of and the relationships between the structural components within these societies. Over the 2 millennia of the Bronze Age across the Near East, we have textual references to several standard components of major centers: the ruler's palace, major temples, and an assembly of elders or prominent families. There's abundant material evidence for the first two, and textual and material evidence representing or documenting independent residence, with textual documentation for a whole range from large estates to small individual households, often integrated via various mechanisms into kin groups, guilds, or other types of corporate entities. We could potentially see all of these at protopalatial Malia, and I think Ilse tried too hard perhaps to integrate them into a single heterarchical framework, whereas the actual cross-cutting integrating mechanisms are probably more varied, fluid, and situationally specific, but still work within an overall hierarchical structure. I think sticking a name on it, heterarchy or factions, gives us a false sense that we have actually learned something, whereas the actual character and the processes remain undetermined. It's the agora and associated structures which potentially intrigue me the most, and I hope that the recent cleaning and architectural restudy of these will give us a clearer idea of the potential roles of this constellation of architectural contexts. And returning to Katia Mu, this may not be as exceptional as is often viewed. Here I plotted it at the same scale with various other architectural complexes on the underlying assumption that constructing and maintaining these sorts of establishments might require similar resources. So there may be some underlying similarities there. That some of these are sometimes the central structure in a smaller community, some probably the focus for small regional polities, as at Petras and Gornia, but also comparable in scale to what will have been just one among probably several such institutions within a large urban community, may suggest new ways of thinking about them. Now, returning to the ancient Near Eastern city, Elizabeth Stone has argued that medieval Middle Eastern cities provide an appropriate model for their ancient counterparts. Drawing on both textual and archaeological evidence, including her own fieldwork at Mashgan Shapir, she proposes that cities were divided into quarters, with group allegiance based variably on kinship, occupational specializations, and ties to the original communities from which the city dwellers probably emigrated. Some texts refer to decision-making sub-assemblies at the level of the quarter within the city. Now, this could be a relevant model for thinking about Minoan urban organization, while also recognizing that the relative importance of the palace, temples, and an assembly representing such independent groups vary significantly in time and space across the textually documented ancient Near East. We then need to investigate the range of ways such institutions worked, how they articulated with each other, under what conditions these associations changed, and how these dynamics may be represented in the material record that we can recover. So how do we move forward? Ideally, we'd have a lot more idea of the urban texture, but even with extensive excavations, as at Ugarit here on the right, it really is very difficult to get an overview of how the components were integrated in the absence of written documents, and this is something we simply have to face. But a more effective understanding of Bronze Age urban institutions and social structures would, I think, give us a better idea of the possibilities. After looking at a lot of Bronze Age Near Eastern urban centers, I'm particularly struck by two distinctive characteristics of the Minoan centers. First, of course, the absence of major temples. We can see this to some degree at Ugarit and other Levantine centers, though they are still identifiable and physically prominent temples, which we simply seem not to have on Crete, unless, of course, one considers the palaces themselves to be temples, as has been argued. Secondly, large open spaces, public spaces at the core of communities seem to be more important on Crete than elsewhere, suggesting a greater importance for inclusive public performances in social integration within these communities. Such spaces are particularly associated with the major palaces and seem less crucial or less elaborated in the context of smaller palaces, villas, etc. So the suggestion there that these appear to be some sorts of public performances which are specific to the major palatial centers, presumably linked to their wider regional political roles. But I want to shift now in terms of thinking a little bit about how we put some people into these urban contexts. Now, I want to briefly look at developmental dynamics and the case of Knossos as an extreme case of Minoan urbanism. For a century, starting with Arthur Evans's excavations of the palace and the grand houses, investigation is concentrated at the core of the Bronze Age city. Here I plot prehistoric sherds in the recent survey I've been conducting with colleagues at Knossos, with on the right the black dots noting the previous archaeological work. As you can see from the contrast, there were extensive areas of the site which had not previously been investigated at all. So our understanding of the development of the community is changing quite a bit. Plotting ceramics by phase, we can document the very rapid expansion and eventual collapse of the prehistoric city, which reached a maximum of 1 kilometer, with, I would estimate, 20 to 25,000 people at its maximum extent in LM1. Here I've done the same with Phaistos, relying on the more limited excavated soundings and preliminary indications from the recent survey. The large uncertainty is because of the extreme concentration of excavations near the palace. And most Italian researchers consider there to have been a very serious contraction of the site and reduction in its significance in the Neopalatial period, MM3b to LM1b. Here we've done the same for Malia, basing estimates on the wider distribution of excavated built soundings, except for the Protopalatial period, where it's also possible to bring in and flesh out the picture with the preliminary results of Sylvie Muller's survey. Despite the very different databases on which these reconstructions have to be based, the three centers seem to keep pace with each other from the pre-palatial through the Protopalatial period, each reaching about half a square kilometer in extent in the Protopalatial period over the course of about 250 years. The Neopalatial period marks a significant divergence of trajectories, with the centers at Phaistos and Malia seemingly stagnating or even contracting, whereas Knossos continues to expand exponentially through the Neopalatial period. So very much in contrast to what we can see at those other centers, Knossos experienced continued dramatic expansion to about, say, a square kilometer, double the size attained by either of those other centers. I've used the population estimates for these sites as a basis for suggesting minimum territories which would have been necessary in each period to support the population of the city. I emphasize that these are very much minimum subsistence territories and merely give an idea of the scale. They do not purport to map actual territories or political polity boundaries. But at the same time, I think they provide a better basis or starting point for discussing these than previously purely notional assumptions of natural territories that have been proposed in the past. I've estimated subsistence needs at a half a hectare per person. This does not allow for elite consumption, palatial ceremonies, feasts of various scales, or surpluses to support trade, production and consumption of valuables, etc. So very much minimum territorial estimates. We can do the same exercise for Phaistos, again estimating minimal subsistence only. The maximum for the Neopalatial period is probably a significant overestimation given the current suggestions for probable depopulation at Phaistos itself in this period. And here I've indicated the same sequence of estimates for Malia. In this case, the boundaries that I've suggested are very well defined by the encircling uplands. I've kept the same territorial estimate here for the Proto and Neopalatial period since the city survey indicates no expansion in the later period. Now, acknowledging even the minimal territorial implications, this gives us a basis for questioning the present largely static model, which essentially assumes stable territories from the establishment of the three main palaces at the start of the Protopalatial period to the end of the Neopalatial and LM1b. For Knossos alone, we could see that the consequence of continued expansion through the Neopalatial period, with its notional territory encroaching on pre-existing small centers and having to incorporate them to be able to keep expanding, and thereby manage a large enough territory to feed its own residents, as well as those of the other sites of various scales in the countryside around it. To date, we have no evidence of significant, I'm thinking sites on the order of 5 to 10 hectares, second-order communities in the territories of Fesdos or Malia. In this sense, they fit a fairly classic city-state model and provide a marked contrast, highlighting the very different political situation of neopalatial Knossos. For comparison, the later Greek city-states tended to be very small, replicating each other across the landscape, as mapped here for classical Boeotia. Very few cities across the entire Greek world reach the size of Knossos. For Roman cities, we have a similar picture. Most are also quite small, serving as local centers. Only a very few cities were exceptionally large, acting as trade and administrative hubs. Some of the most sophisticated models of ancient urbanism have been developed and extensively debated in Roman history, and these have now been explored for a couple of decades in Roman archaeology. And they're now increasingly beginning to be considered for the Greek polis, in both cases now taking advantage of detailed but pretty patchy textual information. Two major models, originally formulated by Weber and developed by Findlay, are of the consumer city and the producer city. The former emphasizes an agricultural basis for wealth, the latter industry and commerce. This debate is raised for several decades with variants and additions. In fact, not surprisingly, different Roman cities seem to fit different models, with Rome and a few other major administrative cities, usually coastal and on major trade routes, falling at the producer end of the scale. Recent research with both texts and archaeology relating to early Near Eastern cities stresses the agricultural role, with the bulk of the agricultural role of the bulk of the urban residential population. I wanted to touch on this substantial comparative base because from much of the Aegean literature, one gets the impression that Minoan towns were not principally agricultural, but were centers of craft, industry, or trade. I think we're really over-egging it. I would argue there simply wasn't the volume of demand to support such a degree of specialization. But we've yet to engage with the producer-consumer city kind of debate in Aegean prehistory, and I think that would be useful for us to start to think about. It's very difficult to quantify the composition of the population from the archaeological evidence that we have. So I want to approach this a little bit more circuitously through a process of elimination. The basis for territorial models of the hinterlands of urban sites is the cost-effective organization of rural land use around a center based on the labor intensity required for different agricultural activities and crops. And due to transport costs, this limits the scale of agriculturally based urban centers and their support territories. These production and transportation costs put very real limits on the size of individual communities. Communities are either constrained and cannot grow, and so if populations are expanding, they need to bud off and found new communities in new territories, or the core community will continue to grow, as here, but has to do so by dominating neighboring communities and supporting its expanding population through exacting taxes or tribute from its now dependent neighbors. This model is backed up by plenty of modern examples and has been applied to medieval historical data. But is this model actually particularly relevant to Bronze Age palace-centered economies? Well, studies of ancient Near Eastern texts support this sort of land use zonation around communities, with the intensity of cultivation declining with distance from the city. So we're probably onto a winner there. And increasingly, we can document it archaeologically as well, with sure scatters to define cultivation areas now being complemented by the depressed hollowways radiating out from Near Eastern Bronze Age sites, which were worn down by the repeated daily commutes by farmers from cities to the fields along tracks and droveways. So it seems to be a model that has some relevance to Bronze Age urban centers. Turning just to early modern Cretan data, we could see Cretan subsistence farmers basically conforming to the logic of the underlying processes in their own spatial behavior. They made similar decisions about access to their own fields and taking their surpluses to market. This, of course, doesn't mean that ancient Cretans necessarily behaved the same way, but it does show the relevance of these sorts of models to the specific Cretan landscape with pre-mechanized agricultural production technology. Here, I've imposed rough half-hour catchments on my estimated minimum support territories for Fesdos and Malia, which could be seen to be pushing the limits of largely self-sufficient, agriculture-based urban centres. Knossos was comparable to the others in the proto-palatial period, but in the neo-palatial would have had to draw on support from well beyond what could be effectively farmed by its own resident population, there which I've notionally shaded in blue. So we need to construct a much more extensive hierarchical system for Knossos to have supported itself, mobilizing agricultural products through local, formerly independent, but now subordinate centres such as Knossos. Here, to get an idea of the scale of the practical logistics, I estimate the subsistence needs of Knossos and other centres at specific phases. And for simpler weight calculations, I'm assuming that all food was grain. For late Minoan I Knossos, with an estimated population of 20,000 people, this translates into more than 200,000 donkey loads of food a year, or 550 donkey loads a day entering Knossos. Okay? And given that most food will have been brought in from the south, I think it's perhaps not quite so surprising as it's always seemed to me, the massive viaduct that was built immediately south of the palace to guarantee access across the steep Vlichia Gorge. Again, making very gross calculations, I would estimate that about 60% of the population of Knossos could directly farm fields within about a 2-hour catchment of the city. And this suggests that farming would have been uneconomical for 40% of the residents of the city, who must have been supported by food produced by others, brought in from more distant fields. Obviously, the urban-based farmers could have contributed to supporting their fellow residents, but if so, their life would really have been pretty miserable. For Knossos to have been self-sufficient would approach late Ottoman levels of taxation, where the family which worked the land might be allowed to retain as little as a fifth to a third of the yield. And as we all know, that didn't work out very well. Now, most taxation regimes could probably not be anywhere near as extreme, recognizing the very low margins and chronic uncertainty of Mediterranean subsistence farming, as recently documented very thoroughly by Paul Halstead. At Ugarit, for example, the palace expected 25% of the produce from lands it leased out and 10% in taxes from freeholders. That may be a more reasonable set of expectations in an Aegean context. Keeping the resident farmers of Knossos at abject poverty level, the remainder of the population might just have been supported, at least in terms of bare subsistence, by the 60% of those residential farmers. But there would have been no surplus wealth for wealth consumption, court ceremonies, feasts, etc. So we need to look more widely afield. Now, Renfrew, in developing his model of Aegean redistributive economies, suggested the elaborate villas identified in the countryside were local administrative nodes, channeling agricultural produce into the palaces. We now know that most of these, or nearly all of them, are not country estates, but rather prominent houses within small communities. But the same role for them seems to be generally assumed. But Kostas Christakis' analyses of storage capacities in these structures provides no real support for the assumption that they were major organizing foci. They are simply not the equivalent of Roman latifundia. Kostas argues for such a role, but his own figures, I think, are far too low to support that argument. Indeed, Christakis' systematic analysis of storage capacities in urban sites indicates that very few households at any sites were clearly self-sufficient. So how were they being provisioned? Either there was a considerable scale of centralized rationing or redistribution, which we've spent the past 30 years trying to scale down since Renfrew's model was initially criticized, or perhaps there was a very active market exchange, allowing regular general access to large amounts of produce. That's another debate that I don't particularly want to get into here. Beyond its own immediate catchment, Knossos' exceptional growth almost certainly relates to a very significant expansion in its regional administrative role. The increasingly recognized complex history of individual palatial centers in central and eastern Crete invites interpretation as a pattern of Knossian political expansion. I might sketch this development as here. Now, while we can haggle over the details, I think it clear that we have to recognize a much more dynamic political history for Crete than has been assumed for most of the past century. This will have engendered a dramatically changing role for Knossos as a political center, with a scale and complexity of regional administration not seen before, or at any other site in the Middle Bronze Age or Late Bronze Age Aegean. For example, I would suggest that Ayatriada was developed as a late Minoan one, and it was implanted as a Knossian administrative center, which replaced Festos. The relocation looks like a very explicit political act to break with local traditional power structures. But unlike Festos, it is not a major urban center. Yet its Linear A documents indicate that it must have replaced Festos as the local administrative center. There are major debates about the sudden establishment of the palace and center at Galatas. It was founded in Middle Minoan 3A and abandoned early in LM1A, and most arguments link it politically to Knossos, 16 kilometers away. By my growth model, the expanding minimum support zone for Knossos should have reached the Pediada in the Middle Minoan 3 period. So this looks to me like the rapid development of a substantial urban site and local regional settlement system, arguably through Knossian colonization, channeling resources to support the rapidly expanding population of Knossos. So I think we need to be considering some significant agricultural support for Knossos from beyond its own immediate hinterland. If Knossos dominates the center of the island in the later Neopalatial period as sketched here, its support system would have had several hierarchical levels, all needing management and managers. So who were the 40% of the population at Knossos who were not resident farmers? I admit it's taken us a fairly circuitous route to get here, to this point, to ask this question. This is a schematic of the social structure of China in 1900. It's a well-documented example of an essentially non-industrial agrarian state. Comparatively, agrarian states seem to have something in the range of 10 to 25% of royalty, gentry, administrators, merchants, and artisans, the non-farming segment of society. Estimates of 25% seem to include all craftspeople, and that includes village carpenters, potters, etc. So I think we could bracket it more as an expectation of maybe 10 to 20% of the population of an early urban site, early urban state system as being non-primary producers. Does this sound at all realistic for ancient societies? Well, at Girsu in Mesopotamia in the Ur III period, the wife of the king had a household of 700. Okay, with more in other branches of the royal household. I've seen suggestions for royal courts in medieval Europe of some 200 to 500 courtly retainers. So we are probably talking about figures on that kind of scale. I'm still collecting sources for this. It's a bit confusing because most of the ancient Near Eastern sources are ration lists for all dependents of an individual institution, which would include agricultural workers, shepherds, and such like that. So I'm trying to sort out which ones relate specifically to urban dwellers. I was reminded of the scale of the institutional support staff a couple of months ago by the news that when the Dowager Duchess of Devonshire died, all 600 employees of her 7-square-kilometre agricultural estate at Chatsworth lined up to see the funeral cortege leave, okay? And that's in there for any of you Downton Abbey fans. Okay, now I'd estimate about a third of the regional population of north-central Crete was resident at Knossos, with up to another third in the local centres, and the final third resident on the land in farms and hamlets, based on intensive surveys elsewhere on the island. 10 to 20% of the 60,000 overall would be about 6,000 to 12,000 population, of whom a quarter would be adult males. So we'd be looking at something like 1,500 to 3,000 individuals in such non-farming roles. This is not a particularly excessive number, where we consider that there were at least 75 administrative scribes working in the palace in the later LM3A period. And this estimate fits pretty well with the sort of estimated guesstimate of 40% non-farming population. 8,000 overall, 2,000 adult males, say. Though with so many of them concentrated within Knossos itself, it would have produced a very top-heavy population. So Knossos would have had a very mixed, and I think uniquely highly competitive population. Some justification for such a system, or such an outline, is given by the palatial records we have, particularly the 4,000 or so individuals mentioned as having some dependent relationship with the later Mycenaean palace of Pylos. At Pylos as well, 700 individuals are mentioned by name in the Linear B tablets, and at Knossos about 1,000. With more than 2,500 individuals noted on the small number of administrative tablets surviving from Neopalatial Ayatriada, I think we might consider the Minoan Neopalatial system to be at least as centralized and bureaucratized as the later Mycenaean systems. I therefore see the palaces, and in the Neopalatial period Knossos in particular, as increasingly centralizing power, administrative, and economic control in Crete. This would have created a uniquely large and competitive courtly culture at Knossos in the Neopalatial period, precisely when we see such intense investment in innovation and material elaboration, whether artifactual or indeed architectural, as a number of people in this audience have discussed in the past. This provides a slightly different context for interpreting what has often been identified as Knossianization of Neopalatial culture, with debates as to whether this should be interpreted simply as urban elite culture, Knossian cultural hegemony, or political dominance, or perhaps all three. I suggest driven by the social pressure cooker of social competition at courtly Knossos. And this expectation also receives new theoretical support from the work of Louis Betancourt and his colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute, analyzing modern urban data, which shows that characteristics that relate to social interactions, whether it be GDP, innovations, or indeed crime, all increase exponentially in relation to city population. So in this paper, I've tried to consider ways in which we can explore the increasing amount of evidence available for Minoan urbanism. I think we have some rich but quite patchy and very challenging data, but I think we could be making more of it. And I think we have more to learn about urban structure and dynamics through analogical comparisons with other, better documented Bronze Age palace-centered societies. Thank you.